I'm sure you're familiar with the beginning of a quilt pattern where they list all the pieces of the fabric that you need to cut out to make a quilt. Did you know that if the border measurements are listed there, specifically the length of the border, you shouldn't cut it then? You should wait to cut your borders? That's because no one's 1/4 inch seam is likely to be exactly a 1/4 inch all the way across on every seam of that quilt. And when it's not exactly a 1/4 inch, that center part that you pieced is likely to turn out to be a different size than the pattern is expecting it to be. Which means those borders, if you've cut them already, could be either too long or too short. Let's look at what can happen when you don't match the length of your border to the actual measurement of your quilt. I have a top here that is nice and flat. And then I have another top over here. It's a little hard to see. I've tried to have the lighting so you can see, but you can see that it's a little ripply over here, right? If I do this here, that's nice and straight. But this, there's extra here. You can see the extra here and there, right? There's lots of extra, whereas on this quilt, it's all nice and flat. That's because when I sewed the borders on this quilt, these borders were just a little bit bigger than they needed to be for the middle of the quilt. When I sewed the borders on, I made it fit. Making it fit is called easing when you're making clothes. And in clothes, that ease or extra bit on one side of the seam is helpful for making the clothes fit right, like in the cap of a sleeve. But with a quilt, it makes the top not perfectly flat. And why would that matter? Well, when a not flat top gets quilted, the top gets flattened down onto the flat batting and backing. And this extra ease has to go somewhere. If you try to make everything nice and straight and flat, you're going to have some puckers or tucks somewhere along the edge to make everything flat, to take up that extra ease in the border. If you decide, no, I really don't want tucks in my quilt, taking up that extra ease, then you can try to pull the backing and the batting a little bit so that everything fits in there. But what will happen is as you're pulling and making everything lie nice and flat, it's going to stretch the corners out so they're not quite square anymore. You'll have misshapen corners and probably a quilt that when it's hanging on the wall doesn't hang flat. So this is what can happen when you cut your borders based on the pattern measurements instead of what the quilt center actually measures. The best way of doing this is to measure in the center of the quilt. You don't necessarily want to trust the sides because if you've been playing or pushing or doing anything with this quilt, these are going to get stretched out and maybe get a little bigger on the side. The little seams at the edges might be coming apart a little bit, and it'll be a little bigger on the edges. The best thing to do is measure the middle of your quilt, and you actually want to measure in 3 places and then take an average of those measurements. So I usually measure once in the middle, and I like to start at 1 over here and then subtract 1 from over here. If you can remember that, it's a lot easier to get accurate measurements. So I'd measure once there, and once there, and once down here. Add them all up, divide them by 3, and you'll have the average measurement. Then cut your border that size and then pin it nice and evenly along the edge so that you get a nice even seam. And you'll end up with a nice flat quilt top that will hang nicely on your wall. I do some cutting of the border when I'm doing the cutting of all the rest of the pieces. I cut it as wide as it's going to be, so I have all the pieces cut out of my fabric. I just don't cut how long the border is going to be. If you do that and make sure you measure all the 3 points across your quilt, you'll have a much better success at getting nice flat tops. I hope this helps you have happier sewing.